And that language is going to be kind of obvious in the next couple of pieces here. So here's where I told you the way that compensation has historically worked and still stated that it works on this. So we are having a conversation with the seller on what we're going to charge them. So seller agrees to pay the firm a total fee of blank percent of the gross sales price of the property, or a flat fee, which shall include the amount of any compensation paid by firm as set forth in paragraph 8 below to other real estate firms, including individual agents and sole proprietors, naming them cooperating real estate firms. And notice what it says here, okay? We're about to talk about 3 ways that you have earned your fee. Okay, 3 ways that you have earned your fee. 1, if a ready, willing, and able buyer is procured by the firm, a cooperating real estate firm, the seller, or anyone else during the term of this agreement at the price and on the terms set forth herein, or at any price and upon any terms acceptable to the seller. And so notice that because this is an exclusive right to sell listing agreement, it doesn't matter where this buyer came from. We could have found the buyer. Cooperating firm could have brought the buyer. The seller could have brought the buyer. Anybody could have brought the buyer, but we still get paid. If we procure a ready, willing, and able buyer at terms acceptable to the seller, we have earned our fee. It's a big triggering point there. Now, number 2 goes on to say, if the property is sold, option, exchange, conveyed, or transferred, or the seller agrees during the term of this agreement or any renewal hereof to sell, option, exchange, convey, or transfer the property at any price and upon any terms whatsoever. And that's the most common, right? When they agree to sell the property and or sell the property, we've earned our fee. The last one is going to be the answer to, I believe it was Beverly's question. I said, hang tight. Beverly's question was, what happens if a buyer comes along after our agency agreement has ended? This is got 3 names and they're all testable. Okay, this is sometimes called the tail clause, T-A-I-L, like a dog tail or cat tail. Okay, tail, your back end, your tail. A tail clause, an extender clause, or a protection period. All 3 of these names could be used in the test. Tail clause, extender clause, protection period. Tail clause and extender clause is what they call it on the national side of the test, if you see that. North Carolina, we call it the protection period. So here's what it says. If the circumstances set out in 1 or 2 above have not occurred, and if within 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever we put in here, after the expiration date, we're going to refer to it as the protection period, the seller either directly or indirectly sells, options, exchanges, conveys, or transfers, or agrees to do any of those things for the property upon any terms whatsoever to any person with whom the seller, firm, or any cooperating real estate firm communicated regarding the property during the term of this agreement or any renewal hereof. So in other words, if our agency relationship ended and it falls within that period of time and they try to sell it to somebody that we introduced to them, the property, they still owe us our commission. That is that protection period, this period of protection. Now understand that the only reason that this exists is oddly specific scenarios. Imagine I listed a home for sale. An unrepresented buyer comes along. I show the property to this unrepresented buyer. While I'm showing this property to this buyer, they recognize photos on the wall. Turns out they didn't even realize this house was one of their friends. And so now they pick up the phone, they call their friend and say, hey, listen, I like your house, I want to buy it. Let's just wait it out until your agency agreement dies. And then I'll make you an offer. You'll get a deal, I'll get a deal, because we're just going to burn your agent out of the deal. This is really what that's designed to protect. Because it goes on to basically be worthless for most circumstances. Here's what it says. Provided that the names of such persons are delivered or postmarked to the seller within 15 days after the expiration date. There's problem number 1. We don't know the names of everybody that was shown the property. I know the agent who showed the property. I don't know their clients' names. So I would have to say the client of this agent, the client of this agent, to provide this list. The other thing it goes on to state is that, however, a seller shall not be obligated to pay the fee if a valid listing agreement is entered into between seller and another real estate broker and the property is subsequently sold, optioned, exchanged, conveyed, or transferred during this protection period. So if they hire another broker, it sucks to suck, Chuck. So tail clause, extender clause, protection period. Same names. Kind of useless in the real world, but testable. So all of that outlined when we've earned our fee. If one of those three things arises, we've earned the fee. But then the supplemental question is, when do we get paid? So it is considered due and payable once you've earned it as set forth above. Most commonly, number one, at distribution of proceeds from the sale of the property by closing attorney. Even though we've earned the fee the second we procured a ready, willing, and able buyer, we're not getting paid until the property closes. Two, the seller's failure to sell the property, including but not limited to the seller's refusal to sign an offer to purchase for the property at the price and terms stated herein or any other terms acceptable, or the seller's agreement with a buyer to unreasonably modify or cancel an executed sales contract. So let me explain, folks. If Bill calls me up and says, Seth, I want to list my house. I say, great. Bill and I signed an exclusive right to sell listing agreement. We agree that $400,000 is a reasonable price to sell his property, and we put that in there. And after marketing it for a few weeks, he gets an offer for $425,000. And that's obviously more than what we said he was looking to get. And so that is what we would consider an acceptable offer. If it's a standard contract, 30-day close, 45-day close, whatever, I've done my job. So let's say Bill says, yeah, I've changed my mind. I don't want to sell anymore. Bill still has to pay me. And that's what we're saying. Folks, please don't get confused. We can never force a seller to sell. We've done our job, though, regardless. So even though it says that they agree to sell it at this price, we can't force them to sell it. But when that offer comes in, I've done my job. I've earned my money. And so if he changes his mind, tough cookies, he's got to pay me the full commission that he was supposed to pay me. Is everybody with me here? The only time we're going to go after somebody in that regard, though, is if they change their mind. I mean, as long as we're not getting paid until we get a closing. I'm telling you, we're not trying to trick anybody and get out of the deal. We are going to look after you until the final day of closing to make sure everything goes off without a hitch. The reason it's written this way is so that we don't get screwed over because we did the work and you're trying not to pay us now. If you didn't want to sell it, you shouldn't have hired us. Another word of caution, folks, and it's going to come up in a second, and I just want to make sure you understand something. If you ever get a test question that says something like, oh, we guarantee that we're going to sell our property, that's not the answer. There is no guarantees. I told you, be very cautious of those absolutes. We're going to put forth our best efforts to find that ready, willing, and able buyer. We're not guaranteeing anything. We're not guaranteeing that the house doesn't have issues. We're not guaranteeing that we're going to sell it. There's no guarantees. And so the last one that would trigger the we're due and payable now for our compensation if earned, seller's breach of this agreement. If they breach it, they don't want to sell it, they've changed their minds, they, don't participate, they don't sign documents, they could arguably be in breach, and that would make us, due and payable now if it goes that route. I'm going to skip over this one because that's not going to be on your test. Additional compensation, and I'm going to be very careful because, yet again, some of the NAR stuff make this a very slippery slope, but what North Carolina states, and I briefly told you this already when we were starting the agency section and I was teaching you some of the prohibited acts, real estate licensees have to disclose in writing any bonus, rebate, commission, additional incentive, or whatever that they're going to make prior to their client making or accepting an offer. That's the easiest way to think about it. And so what this section says is, well, hey, you're going to give us permission to accept additional compensation so long as we disclose it to you in writing prior to you making or submitting that offer. And that's all this is stating, because we have to have it in writing to be legally compliant. The other thing I told you is that you're never allowed to accept bonuses that would violate RESPA. So, I mean, that's what it comes down to in a nutshell. Now, here's the last really big piece. I'm not going to say the last piece, but the last really big piece that kind of goes hand in hand with everything else I was teaching you. I told you up here, we talk about how much we're going to charge as a whole. And down here, we're advertising or discussing how we're going to share it. And so, in other words, it says cooperation with compensation to other firms. Firm has advised the seller of the firm's company policies regarding cooperation and the amounts of any compensation that will be offered to other brokers, including but not limited to seller subagents. You know that term. Buyer agents or both. Brokers who do or do not participate in a listing service, and brokers who are or are not realtors. Seller authorizes the firm to check all that apply. Cooperate with subagents representing the seller and offer them blank. Cooperate with buyer agents representing the buyer and offer them blank. And so, folks, I told you right here, this is where the authority to act as a seller subagent comes from. The listing firms and the seller's conversations. We decide whether or not they want to allow buyer's agents, seller subagents, or both. And historically speaking, and it will still be tested this way more than likely, how would you figure out if you were allowed to act as a seller subagent as a cooperating broker? You would look in the MLS to see the offer of compensation for a seller subagent. Because if they put that they're offering seller subagency nothing, then they're not working with a seller subagent. But if they advertise that they're going to offer the seller subagent compensation, that means they will accept seller subagents. The last couple things that are outlined in here that we really need to talk about are the obligations, because folks, this really does outline the obligations between the firm and the seller. Okay, seller has obligations. Firm has obligations. Told you our obligations are not guaranteeing anything. So here's what it says. The firm agrees to provide the seller the benefit of the firm's knowledge, experience, and advice in marketing and sale of the property. Seller understands that the firm makes no representation or guarantee as to the sale of the property, but firm agrees to use its best efforts in good faith to find a buyer who is ready, willing, and able to purchase the property. So we're going to put forth our best efforts. We're going to do our darndest, as I like to say, but we're not guaranteeing anything. Janet says, who gets to decide the percent of compensation? We do. They do. It's negotiable. If you want to charge them 1,000%, tell them you're going to charge them 1,000%. When they say go to hell, you either charge them less or you walk away. Because and that's the thing, folks. We're going to talk about the legislation here in a second, but you have to understand, part of the NAR stuff came from what we call alleged price fixing, where we said prices were set, because everybody's like, oh yeah, we always charge 6%. Yeah, 6% is a very normal amount for us to charge. And then what we shared depends on the market, but there is no normal. We can't say normal. We can't say, standard, because that would suggest price fixing, which is a no-no. A couple other things it clarifies here. Disclosure of material terms of an offer. Folks, you are not, in North Carolina, you are not allowed to disclose the terms of an offer with other offerors, meaning other people who submitted offers, unless you have permission from the person whose offer it is. And I want you to think about the logic there. Think of it this way. If you're a listing agent and you get 10 offers and you've got one that is really good and the other 9 are okay, can you imagine calling the one person whose offer is really good and saying, hey, listen, you're currently winning, but we think we can get more money out of some of these other folks. Would you give us permission to screw your buyer over so that we could tell everybody else what you're paying so we can get more money for the buyers, and you'll probably get screwed. The other buyers will get screwed, but the sellers will win. Is anybody in their right mind going to give you permission to do that? No. So that's what it says. We are not allowed to disclose the terms of offers in North Carolina unless we get permission of the offeror, not the seller. Seller can't give us permission. It has to be the person whose offer it is. Of course, this section right here says we have to disclose material facts regardless of whether they want us to or not. It is what it is. This is another thing, folks, right here that is required in North Carolina. I told you there are 4 things that have to be in every single agency agreement in North Carolina. One of them was a definite expiration date. Here's another one. It's what we call the prescribed non-discrimination provision. It's required by rule. And so it says the agent, meaning the firm, shall conduct all brokerage activities in regard to this agreement without respect to the race, color, religion, sex, national origin, handicap, or familial status of any party or prospective party. And then it goes on to say, further, realtors have an ethical duty to conduct such activities without respect to the sexual orientation or gender identity of a party or any prospective party. So those are 2 of the 4 things that are required in all written agency agreements. The last 2 things of the 4 required are down here. And I'm going to backtrack for a second, just so you know the 4. And I'm going to have it on a slide too in a second, but those are testable. The last 2 that are required is the individual broker's license number. So if you look right here, individual license number. Oddly enough, it's not the firm's license number. It is the licensee's license number, the person who's signing it. But we do put both on there. But by rule, only the individual broker's license number is on there. And then, of course, the last one is signatures of all the parties. So I'm going to say it again. The 4 things required on all agency agreements in North Carolina: definite expiration date, non-discrimination provision, the individual licensee's license number, and signatures of all the parties. Those 4 required on all written agency agreements in North Carolina. I'm going to focus on only the most consequential things because I don't think... Excuse me. This is just talking about marketing, folks. When we're dealing with marketing, we have to have permission from our broker in charge to advertise. And of course, we also need permission from sellers to advertise in certain ways. So the seller has to say, okay, yeah, it's okay to put signs in the yard. Yes, it's okay to hold open houses. Yes, it's okay to do advertising other than the internet, like print media. They have to say it's okay to do internet advertising. So we need permission of the seller and our BICs to advertise these properties. So this talks about the different ways we're going to advertise. That's not going to be on there. That's not going to be on, well, not in that context. Oh, here, let me show you this. This is, remember when we talked about material facts? And I told you one of the things that was a material fact for life in North Carolina was EIFS, also called synthetic stucco. So it's asking whether or not the property has ever had that synthetic stucco, because it would be a material fact even if it was removed and replaced with something else. We'll talk about that in a different. Folks, this is talking about current liens on the property. We've talked about liens a little bit, but we're going to get more in depth in the financing section. But why would it be important to know what liens are on the property in this when we're having this conversation to list your house?
Is it like in case if it's a lien attached to the property?
Well, it's almost assuredly going to be a lien attached to the property. Yeah, there you go. They would be appurtenant if not removed. And then as Bill said, we got to make sure there's enough equity. Are we going to be able to pay that off for what we can sell for? Can we sell it for enough that you're going to pay off all your liens and still have some money left over? Because if not, we got a problem. So it's going to be what we call a short sale or something similar. So we ask them to make sure that we kind of have some good discussions there. Is the property subject to any leases? Because those would be pertinent as well. Special assessments, we've talked about a little bit. We'll talk more about them later. Seller's duties. Okay, we already talked about the firm's duties. Put forth our best efforts to find a ready, willing, and able buyer. What is the seller's job? Make the property available for showings. Fill out the paperwork we ask them to fill out. Comply with emails. You respond to us, right? They've got to make sure that we can do our job. Of course, that includes the RPODs, the MOG, the lead-based paint disclosure, anything that's required of them. Those are their duties. This is not consequential. Folks, here's the last thing that I'm going to get into on this listing agreement before we move on into different things. And I'm going to read this to you because it's going to reiterate the worthlessness of dual agency, because I showed you what it says on the working on the real estate agent's disclosure. But if you look right here on the listing agreement, this is where we get the authority to do dual agency. So remember earlier, I think I used Savannah as an example, and I said, okay, well, if we sign an exclusive agency agreement, we start off with I'm exclusive to her and she's exclusive to me, because exclusive listing agreement means she can't have another firm. Exclusive buyer agency agreement means she can't have another firm. But we still start off exclusive as well. Bree says, this is no privilege of omission on this form for the client, correct? Like the client can't. Do you mean, are we in trouble if they don't tell us something?
Yeah.
Well, it depends. Because remember what I told you, reasonably ascertainable material facts. If it's something that they elect to not tell us, but we should have and could have discovered it, we're in trouble, they're not. But if it's something that we can't find out, then no, we're not in trouble. If it's something that would be impossible, what we call a latent defect, or something that's not within the scope of our authority to figure out, then no, we're not in trouble. Yeah. So take a look at this language here, folks, because I told you we cannot do dual agency without informed and written consent. And the question, let me ask you this, folks. I explained to you yesterday, what did I tell you about dual agency? What did I keep rehashing with you? What is dual agency? What did I explain it as? Worthless. It's worthless. And so the question that I'm going to ask you before we even read this, I'm going to see if you can deduce this. If it's so worthless, why is it an option? Janet, I'm going to warn you again. The answer will never be money. Folks, y'all have got to let the money go. It will never be you make more money. That's not how this works. You remember the fiduciary responsibilities? There you go, Bridge. Folks, you can't have designated without dual, because designated is a type of dual, and designated is the best thing since sliced bread, because listen, designated is a benefit to a firm because, yes, we do make more money. That means if we charge 6%, the firm keeps all 6% instead of keeping half of it and sending half to another firm. But the great thing about it is not only does the firm make more money, but in designated, we can advocate for our clients, and there's really no harm, no foul compared to a co-broker deal. So that's why it exists. You can't have designated without dual, because it's a type of dual. More than that, folks, imagine that you are in an area. Well, Brooke says buying a new house and selling the old one. That's not going to be dual agency because that's going to be two different transactions. So it has to be the same transaction that you're representing the buyer and the seller. But folks, imagine that we're in an area, either way you slice it, where there is a really, really big brokerage firm with 1,000 agents. If there's 1,000 agents and 1,000 buyers and 1,000 sellers, right? They each have one buyer client and they each have one seller client. There is a pretty good chance that some of those buyers are going to be interested in those 1,000 listings, aren't they? And if we don't have dual agency, then none of those buyers could see any of those listings. Because once you've got the buyer and the seller in the same transaction, you're in dual. And if we don't authorize dual, we got an issue. So let me read this to you and hopefully it'll click a little bit more. Dual agency, okay, it says, the seller understands the potential for dual agency will arise if a buyer who has an agency relationship with a firm becomes interested in viewing the property, meaning the one we're talking about in this listing agreement. The firm may represent more than one party in the same transaction, only with the knowledge and informed consent of all parties for whom the firm acts, informed and written consent. Disclosure of information. In the event the firm serves as a dual agent, the seller agrees that without permission from the party about whom the information pertains, the firm shall not disclose to the other party the following information. 1, that a party may agree to a price, terms, or conditions of sale other than those offered. 2, the motivation of a party for engaging in the transaction unless disclosure is otherwise required by statute or rule. And 3, any motivation about a party which that party has identified as confidential unless disclosure is otherwise required by statute or rule. So what we're saying here is the firm's going to know things about both parties, but we're not going to be able to share them. Bound and gagged and worthless. And so then it goes on to say what our role is as a dual agent. If the firm is acting as a dual agent, folks, and this should sound familiar to yesterday. If the firm serves as agent for both seller and buyer in a transaction involving the property, firm shall make every reasonable effort to represent seller and buyer in a balanced and fair manner. Firm shall also make every reasonable effort to encourage and effect communication and negotiations between seller and buyer. Seller understands and acknowledges that 1, prior to the time dual agency occurs, firm will act as seller's exclusive agent. Now, this is what I explained to you with Savannah earlier. When we sign this agreement, folks, let's say that Savannah and I sign this listing agreement. Do I have a buyer for Savannah's property yet? Probably not. And so that means I am looking after Savannah and Savannah only. And as long as buyers from other firms are the only people that look at that property, I'll never be anything other than Savannah's exclusive agent. But the second that a buyer from our firm wants to see it, I'm not exclusive to Savannah anymore because now the firm is representing the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. So every relationship starts off as exclusive until it's not anymore. And it can only be not anymore as long as people authorize dual agency. So number 2 says, in its separate representation of seller and buyer, firm may obtain information which, if disclosed, could harm the bargaining position of the party provided such information to the firm. And 3, firm is required by law to disclose to seller and buyer any known or reasonably ascertainable material facts. Seller agrees firm shall not be liable to seller for 1, disclosing material facts required by law to be disclosed, and 2, refusing or failing to disclose other information the law does not require to be disclosed, which could harm or compromise one party's bargaining position but could benefit the other party. Well, before we wrap this up, let me give you another example of a test question. If Jack is operating as a dual agent and Jack tells the buyer that the seller's roof leaks, which of the following is true in regard to Jack? And your options are going to be, well, Jack breached his fiduciary duties as the dual agent. Jack violated license law. Jack did nothing wrong. Folks, Jack did nothing wrong. Because remember I told you, you owe material facts to everybody at the club getting tipsy, regardless of representation. So even as that's right, Bill. Everybody at the club getting tips. So even in dual agency, you still are legally obligated to disclose material facts to everybody. Is everybody with me there? Is everybody with me there? You see what it's. I apologize. That was bad. Anyway, here's the wrap up here. I know, Brooks. The seller's role. Now, folks, I absolutely love this. I want you to listen to how stupid this sounds. Absolutely listen to how stupid this sounds. This is what we're telling the seller that their role is if dual agency arises. Should the firm become a dual agent, seller understands and acknowledges that 1, the seller has a responsibility of making the seller's own decisions as to what terms are to be included in any purchase and sale agreement with the buyer client of the firm. In other words, right, Paige, what do you want to offer? It's up to them. They have to make their own decisions. What do you want to offer? 2, seller is fully aware of and understands the implications and consequences of firm's dual agency role as expressed herein to provide balanced and fair representation of the seller and buyer and to encourage and effect communication between them rather than as an advocate or exclusive agent or representative. So in other words, worthless. We're not advocating for anybody. 3, seller has determined that the benefits of dual agency outweigh any disadvantages or adverse consequences. So this is where we're getting into the, are you sure you're sures? Right? Because we're saying this could suck for you. Are you sure you want to do this? And then here's my favorite one out of all of them. Seller may seek independent legal counsel to assist seller with the negotiation and preparation of a purchase and sale agreement or with any matter relating to the transaction, which is the subject matter of the purchase and sale agreement. Let me translate that for you. Well, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, you're welcome to hire an attorney to do the job that I now can't do when dual agency arises, but you still have to pay me. Sounds pretty stupid, doesn't it? What you got, Brooks?
So, with this clause number 4 in section C, does that preclude any other real estate agent acting in an advisory role, like we talked about last week?
Yeah, because dual agency means that the buyer and the seller are represented by the same firm. And so if we're just doing dual, no other agents within our firm, none of them could be in an advisory role in any way, shape, or form. We're all worthless. Can't.
Right, but like, say like they have a friend who's a real estate agent who they didn't sign an agreement with.
Well, I'll tell you right now, that friend's not going to be willing to help them if they didn't sign an agreement with them. But in theory, sure, they could help.
Okay, but like just in an advisory role, they're not getting any compensation.
They're not part of the transaction. Nope.
So, but yes, they can.
Yeah,
right?
Because odds are going to be that they're in a different firm. And so if they wanted to get advice from a different real estate broker from a different firm, I mean, they could. But, yeah, not going to get paid. So, I mean, it has one other final disclaimer in here, right? Should firm become a dual agent, seller waives all claims, damages, losses. Basically, it says, if you don't like the outcome, sucks to suck, Chuck, unless we did something wrong. If we did something wrong, you can come after us. But if we didn't do anything wrong, regardless of whether you like the outcome or not, is on you. And so, yet again, this should reiterate what I told you, folks. It's worthless, and it's screaming from the top of our lungs that it's worthless. However, we cannot have designated without having dual. And that's what it goes on to state. Designated dual agency. When a real estate firm represents both the buyer and the seller in the same real estate transaction, the firm may, in its discretion, offer designated dual agency. If offered, designated dual agency permits the firm, with the prior express approval of both the buyer and seller, to designate one or more agents to represent only the interest of the seller and different agent or agents to represent only the interest of the buyer, unless prohibited by law. And so, a couple interesting pieces here, folks. When a seller or buyer signs this, because it looks the same on both agreements, they're going to sign here or initial here to authorize dual agency. So seller authorizes the firm to act as a dual agent representing both the seller and the buyer. This piece right here is whether or not they're okay with what I called true dual yesterday. In other words, are they okay with it being the same licensee? And I think that was when we used Paige as the example yesterday, where she represented both the seller and the buyer in the same transaction. So seller does or does not authorize the same individual agent to represent both the seller and buyer. Still dual agency either way, but we still want to clarify if that's okay. And so then if they want designated, they would also initial here, right? Here to say yes to dual and here to say yes to designated dual. In addition to authorizing the firm to act as a dual agent, seller authorizes and directs firm to designate an individual agent to represent the seller and a different individual agent to represent the buyer. Firm will practice designated dual agency unless it would not be permitted by law due to those things we talked about yesterday. What were the things? When is designated dual agency prohibited?
Provisional broker.
A BIC and their provisional broker. There you go. And Bridge put in the chat. It's got to be very specific. The same office, right? It's got to be the BIC and their provisional broker. What was the other one? There you go, Paige. If the other agent has already received confidential information about the opposite party, then it's still prohibited, okay? So, of dual, they won't designate it, or they just won't dual. And then, of course, they have this option, folks. If they want exclusive representation only, they would initial here. stating we do not authorize dual agency, and throughout the transaction, we want only exclusive representation. So it says seller desires exclusive representation at all times during this agreement and does not authorize dual agency. Okay, now I've kind of explained this, but I need you to articulate it for me. You got to put this together. If I was working with a seller and they signed here and stated they want exclusive representation only, what does that mean for that seller?
You're a single agent?
Bridge, you're so close there, but I was like, it's just can only engage with you and you alone. They can. There you go, Brad. This means that no buyers represented by our firm can see this property. That's what this means. No buyers represented. But folks, imagine a big firm that has 1,000 buyers under active buyer agency right now. If a seller signs right here, that means all 1,000 buyers we are currently working with cannot see that home. You just lost 1,000 potential buyers. That's kind of a big thing, isn't it? And so yet again, this is a reason why people would typically authorize dual, although they would prefer designated. Now, Brooke says, how would the buyer's agent know? There's a real world answer, but I don't want to confuse you for the textbook. So, let's just go with they just would, okay? Like, because I don't want to confuse you on the test. Like, I know. The thing is, you've got to understand that the textbook version and the real world version, very different. Because I'm going to be on. Here's the honest answer. They don't care. In the real world, buyers are not having this conversation, or buyer agents are not having this conversation. They're just going to show the property and they're not even going to think twice about it. It's done wrong so much in the real world, but you can't focus on that for the test. So you've got to take it literally. A buyer that is represented by a firm cannot see this listing if this is what they sign. Now, folks, I want you to understand something. Sellers can change their mind. Right? This goes back to, I think it was Bree that sent me the thing yesterday talking about amending agency agreements. They can be amended. So if a seller starts off with this stating, I want exclusive representation only, and we get a phone call from a buyer who's represented by a firm, and they say, well, hey, listen, I really like that house. Can you ask the seller if we can do dual agency? And I go to the seller and I say, I got a buyer really interested. Will you allow it? And if they change their mind, they can come in here, they can put a strike through, they can initial here, they can date it, and they can change their mind. Sure they can. But if they want exclusive representation only, that means no buyers represented by a firm could see the property. It's pretty consequential. Let me ask you a question. Does that mean that our firm can't show this property to buyers? There you go, Bree. We can show it to 10,000 buyers, but we will never be representing them. We would have to be acting as a seller sub-agent. How are we feeling? Is your brain hurt yet? Brooks, your brain, of course, is going to hurt. You missed a whole lot yesterday. You have to rewatch that video. So, that's really the bulk of the exclusive right to sell listing agreement. Cheyenne, I was wondering what that face was. I'm like, Cheyenne is exceptionally distraught about this agency stuff. Oh wait, I didn't hear it because you like muted back so quick. But your fire alarm's going off. Yeah, no, that's not good. I was really concerned because he looked so distraught. Yeah, that makes more.
We're good now, and it's been off for like 5 minutes.
Oh God.
I could not hear anything.
You were giving me a complex, Cheyenne. I'm like, God, I know I'm bad, but I didn't think I was that bad because like she just looks like she was in absolute anguish, right? I was starting to get my feelings hurt.
You didn't want to cover my ears when I was close.
Yeah, whatever my feelings. I'm glad you clarified. Yeah, folks, that is the exclusive right to sell listing agreement. So we, are not going to look at the others, but the others do exist out there. Folks, let's get back into the slides, okay? We just talked about the exclusive right to sell listing agreement, and I hit you with some of the most important pieces. Now, I will clarify something, because I said earlier, in order to be entitled to compensation, you have to have an active and current license to be able to do brokerage. And then, of course, aside from that, you have to have that actual valid agency agreement. But here is kind of an interesting testable concept to be aware of. The way that North Carolina license laws are written, if your license goes inactive or expired at any point, you have to cease and desist all brokerage activities. You are not allowed to finish your transaction. You're not allowed to do it. You got to stop, right? Cold turkey. No real estate brokerage if you go inactive or expired. However, one testable thing you need to know. Folks, I'm going to ask this again. Who is the agent? Thank you, Chelsea. See this? If y'all didn't see this, this is Chelsea's answer, which was the firm. I knew what she was saying, but yeah, there you go. The firm. And so I want you to understand this. And I'm going to pick on Chelsea now because she did the thing. If Chelsea was assisting me as my buyer's agent, and Chelsea's license went inactive or expired prior to my closing date, Chelsea cannot come to closing because that would be unlawful brokerage activities, illegal brokerage activities. However, because the firm is the agent, somebody else in the firm who is actively licensed could go to closing in Chelsea's place, and the transaction could still come to fruition. And so here's the testable piece. While Chelsea was not legally allowed to participate in it, since she didn't do any illegal brokerage, she can still legally be paid if the firm wants to, because she would be being compensated for things she did while she was current and active, and she never did illegal brokerage activities. Does that make sense for everybody? But let's say that Chelsea went to closing. If the commission found out about it, they're going to say, you don't get to keep a penny of that. You automatically forfeit your commission. The firm can't accept it if anybody does any illegal brokerage. So as long as you don't do illegal brokerage and the transaction still gets finished by other people who are actively licensed, you can be paid for things you did while you were current and active. So let me ask you a question now that we've talked about listing agreements a little bit. Boop. You know the drill. You read it and then we'll go over it. Yeah, a lot of truths in there. True or false, Bobby Broker of Go Realty has procured a ready, willing, and able buyer at full list price for a listing you have in Governor's Club. However, the seller is unable to deliver title in a reasonable time. Per the exclusive right to sell listing agreement, you have earned your commission. Yeah. because you did your job. You procured a ready, willing, and able buyer, and the fact that the seller can't convey clear title is not your fault. You still did the work. And so they would arguably be in breach of contract, because it does go on to say that they will be able to transfer clear title as part of their obligations per that listing agreement. Now, you've already seen this list, folks, and hopefully this list makes even more sense to you than it did previously, because y'all were on it, right? Y'all did really great with understanding these. And so these are that list of all the different agency contracts. So we just talked about listing contracts, and I told you it's important to think about the parties. It's important to think about how these end and things of that nature. Listing contracts are between the seller and the firm. Buyer agency contracts are between the buyer and the firm. Contract to procure a tenant, less common, but basically this is where a property owner hires us just to find them a tenant, but they don't want us to manage the property. Property management agreement between the landlord and the brokerage firm to manage the property, typically acting in a general agency capacity. And then, of course, the independent contractors agreement that we talked about between you and your firm as well. And so these are just going to be extremely testable, because you will have to differentiate between the 3 different types of listing contracts we talked about. You'll also have to differentiate between like exclusive buyer agency agreements versus non-exclusive buyer agency agreements versus oral buyer agency agreements. So it's just very important to understand you cannot treat every test question equally just because there is a contract in there. You have to understand which contract they're talking about. And we've already talked about the different ways that these agency contracts can potentially die as well. The property specific ones would die with destruction of the property. Agency contracts also die with death of the parties. Well, if we're dealing with a death of an individual licensee, does that kill an agency contract? No, not if there is a brokerage firm, but yes, if what? There you go. If it's a sole proprietorship, that's right. Because then there's no firm. It's just them, right? It's all running through them. And so that would be a little more consequential and would kill it. And as I stated already, every single agency agreement in North Carolina has to be in writing from the offset, except for oral buyer agency agreements. Those are the only, technically tenants can start out oral too, but they're not going to test you on that. But oral buyer agency agreements are the only ones allowed to start off in this oral capacity. But I told you, even oral buyer agency agreements have to be what? There was a word that I gave you for what they have to be in compliance with the rules. There you go. Express. And express means what? Stated. Nailed it. God, y'all are so smart. It's crazy. Now, here's the list of things that I told you have to be on every written agency agreement as well. I named them, and I told you there's going to be a slide for it. Here it is. Has to be signed by all parties. Have to include the individual licensee's license number. Has to have that definite expiration or termination date. And has to have that non-discrimination provision within. This is required in all written agency agreements in North Carolina. So if I gave you a test question and I said, which of the following is true in regard to agency agreements in North Carolina? If one of the answer choices was has to have the individual agent's license number and has to have the non-discrimination provision, that's a true statement. If one of the answers is has to guarantee the sale, not a true statement. Now we're back to where we left off because I kind of skipped around a little bit. So we already talked about the 3 different types of listing agreements, right? Open listing agreement versus exclusive agency versus the exclusive right to sell listing agreement. And the big kickers are when we get paid, if we get paid at all. Because remember, in the exclusive agency and the open, the seller retains the right to sell it themselves. And if they find their own buyer, they're paying nobody nothing. But in the exclusive right to sell listing agreement, doesn't matter where that person comes from, we get paid. I don't necessarily love this graphic. It may be helpful for some of you. If not, ignore it. It's no big deal.